I have told this story only once before, and that was to my valet on the morning I rode after her, and he had the good sense not to look surprised. He simply handed me my coat and said, "The gray horse, your grace. She's faster on the old road." That was the entirety of his commentary on the worst decision I had ever almost made, and I have loved him for it ever since. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is, I am told, one of my more enduring faults. Let me begin where everything began, which is not with her arrival, though I remember that clearly enough, but with the particular variety of silence that lived in Drentham Hall in the months before she came. I had returned from the continent 14 months prior, and the silence that had settled over the house was not the peaceful kind. It was the silence of rooms that had forgotten what they were for, of hallways too wide for one man walking alone, of fires laid each morning in grates I never sat beside. My staff moved through the house like water finding channels around a stone, careful not to disturb me, careful not to look too directly at what I had become. I was, by the charitable estimation of those who knew me, diminished. By the less charitable, my sister Philippa foremost among them, I was broken. The war had taken something from me that had not come back with my body on the transport vessel, and for 14 months I had not troubled myself to search for it. There was the estate to manage, the tenant accounts to review, the London correspondence to address in pointed monosyllables. There was enough. I told myself there was enough. It was Philippa who arranged for Miss Evelyn Marsh to come. I should say from the outset, Philippa's intentions were not malicious. They rarely are. She loves me in the way that efficient people love their less efficient relations, thoroughly and somewhat impatiently. She had watched me for 14 months drowning in ledgers I could not concentrate on, dictating letters my secretary had to quietly redraft because my mind kept slipping off the edge of the page. And she had decided, with the decisive clarity that made her formidable in every drawing room from here to Bath, that what I needed was a better system. What she sent me was a bookkeeper. Miss Evelyn Marsh arrived on a Tuesday in November on the mail coach, carrying a single trunk and a leather case of her own accounting instruments. I was not at the entrance to receive her. I was in the library, staring at a wall which was, by that period, something of a vocation for me. My housekeeper, Mrs. Bellamy, brought her in and showed her to the estate office at the end of the east corridor, and when I finally appeared an hour later to conduct what Philippa's letter had called a brief introductory interview, I found that Miss Marsh had already arranged the previous 12 months of tenant rent records into a system I had not devised, and could not, in that moment, immediately fault. I stood in the doorway. She stood at the long table, holding a sheaf of papers, and she looked at me the way one looks at weather, noting it, accounting for it, and proceeding accordingly. "Your Grace," she said, a curtsy neat and practiced. "Miss Marsh," I looked at the papers, then at the arrangement of the table, which was considerably more orderly than it had been 3 days prior. "You have been at work." "Mrs. Bellamy was kind enough to show me in this morning," she said. "I hope I have not overstepped. I noticed the quarterly summaries were separated from the corresponding receipts, which makes verification more difficult. I have put them together by quarter. If you prefer the previous arrangement, I can restore it." I studied her. She was not young in the way of girls newly out of the schoolroom, all brightness and nerves. She was perhaps 25, with the manner of a woman who had spent those years becoming quietly competent. Her dress was dark blue and well-made but not new. Her hair was brown, pinned without fuss. She had steady gray eyes and a composed expression, and she was looking at me with precisely the degree of attention the situation warranted and no more. "The new arrangement is fine," I said. "Then I will continue. I expect to have a full picture of the estate accounts by Thursday, Your Grace, and I will prepare a summary for your review." She turned back to the papers. I left. That was the whole of our first meeting. I have since learned to find it telling. Most people on meeting me in those days became either very careful or very solicitous. Miss Marsh became neither. She simply went back to work. I would like to say I noticed her immediately, that there was some lightning flash of awareness, some reordering of my interior world. There was not. I was not, at that period, capable of noticing very much. I was existing in the narrow corridor between the rooms I had to occupy and the work I had to do, and everything outside that corridor had gone somewhat gray. But I noticed her work. By Thursday, she had produced a summary that was not only accurate but annotated, small marginal notations in a precise hand, flagging discrepancies. noting where a tenant's arrears appeared to be the result of a crop failure rather than negligence, identifying 2 payments that had been recorded twice in the previous secretary's hand, and therefore falsely inflated the recorded income by £11. She had also, quietly and without being asked, produced a comparative table of the past 3 years of timber revenue that made immediately apparent what I had been too clouded to see. The northern woodlands were being managed in a pattern that would exhaust them within a decade. I sat with that summary for a long time. "This table," I said when I found her in the estate office the following morning. I set the papers on the table. "The timber projection." She looked up from what she was writing. "Yes, I can walk you through the calculation if it would help, Your Grace. The rate of extraction in the northern parcel has been running approximately 30% above what the natural regeneration cycle will support at current spacing, if the pattern continues." "How long have you worked in accounts?" I interrupted. A small pause. "Since I was 17, Your Grace. My father kept the books for several commercial concerns before his health declined. I helped him, and then I managed them alone." I looked at the timber table. "And your previous positions?" "I have been engaged by 3 households before this one, Your Grace, as a bookkeeper and estate secretary. I have references from all 3 if you wish to review them." "That is not what I asked." She waited. "I asked whether your previous positions were satisfactory." Another pause, and then something shifted very slightly in her expression, not warmth exactly, but a kind of careful consideration. "The work was satisfactory," she said. "The circumstances varied." That, I would later understand, was her way of saying that she had been underpaid, underregarded, and in 2 of those 3 households treated as furniture, present and useful and entirely invisible. But at the time, I only nodded. "The timber summary is correct," I said. "I will instruct the head forester to change the extraction plan." "I thought you might," she said, and went back to her work. I stood there another moment. I am not sure why, then I left. November became December. The house did not warm exactly, but it altered. There was an efficiency to the running of things that had not been there before, small adjustments in the household accounts that Mrs. Bellamy attributed to the new bookkeeper's eye. Errors in the quarterly payments to tradesmen that had been quietly producing overcharges for 3 years, and that Miss Marsh caught and corrected. A reorganization of the rent-day system that reduced the confusion that had previously caused 3 of my tenants to pay twice in 1 quarter, and 2 others not at all. The estate ran better. It was simply a fact. I found myself, without quite deciding to, appearing in the estate office at approximately 10 o'clock each morning. This was when Miss Marsh typically had her daily summary prepared, and I told myself it was merely efficient to collect it at a regular time. This was, I now understand, a fiction I was maintaining for reasons that had nothing to do with efficiency. We talked about the accounts. We talked about the tenants. She had a thorough memory for names and circumstances, and when I mentioned the Hadley family's arrears, she said at once, "The wife has been ill. The elder son is 14 and has taken on 2 days additional work at the mill in Alderton to cover the gap. I would suggest extending the arrears period by 1 quarter, Your Grace, which would cost us nothing in the long term and would prevent the family from having to break up to manage." She said it plainly, without sentimentality, and she was right. We talked occasionally about other things. There were moments, I noticed them and then put them away, when the conversation moved past the accounts into something less defined. Once she found me standing at the library window in the gray morning light and came to deliver a letter she had noticed in the Morning Post that required my immediate attention. And when she handed it to me, she looked out at the frost-covered parkland and said, without apparent premeditation, "It is very beautiful here in the winter." I had not expected it. "Had you expected it to be ugly?" I said. "I had expected it to be imposing," she said. "That is usually what one expects of a ducal estate. This is imposing and also quietly lovely, which is a more difficult combination." She caught herself then, as though remembering where she was and to whom she was speaking, and said, "Forgive me, Your Grace, I have your letter." She went. I remained at the window for some time. There is a particular kind of woman I had met, I think, 3 or 4 of them in my life before her, who manages to be entirely present without demanding anything, who does not perform herself, who is not always angling for something or calculating her angle to the room. Miss Marsh was that kind of woman. She was contained. She was competent. She was honest in a way that was so natural and unfussy, it took me some time to recognize it as unusual. And she did not treat me as though I were made of something breakable. The others did. Philippa did in her way. My neighbors did. The tenants did in the way of people who are cautious around a great power they cannot predict. The London correspondents did in the way of men who want something from a duke and therefore approach with extreme care. Even Mrs. Bellamy, who had been with the family since before my birth, had developed a habit of speaking to me in a particular softened tone, as though bracing for something. Miss Marsh did not do this. When she disagreed with me, and she did disagree on 3 occasions in December alone, she said so clearly and gave her reasons and waited for my response. When she thought I was wrong, she told me so. When I conceded, she did not look relieved or triumphant. She simply recorded the updated position and moved on. It was extraordinary. It was, I think, the most restful quality a human being had ever possessed in my company. I began to sleep better. This is perhaps not a romantic observation, but it is a true one. The particular quality of the silence in the house changed. It became less desolate and more simply quiet. I began to notice things again. The frost patterns on the east windows, the sound of the river from the upper corridor on still mornings. The way the light in the library moved from gray to amber in the late afternoon. I noticed in particular that when I was somewhere in the house where I could hear Miss Marsh moving, the faint scratch of her pen in the estate office, her low-voiced conversation with Mrs. Bellamy in the kitchen passage about the household account for candles, I was calmer than when I was in rooms where I could not. I did not, at this point, say anything about this observation, not to myself and certainly not to her. There were small things I noticed, accumulated over the weeks of December as the year turned toward the cold end of itself, that I filed away with no particular intention and no particular plan. The way she took her coffee without sugar and drank it while she worked, not pausing to drink, but moving the cup to her mouth by habit between annotations. The particular expression she produced when she discovered an error in someone else's arithmetic, a small, contained dissatisfaction that was resolved the moment she corrected the figure. The fact that she was the only person in my household who spoke to the dogs as though they were capable of understanding her, and that she did this without self-consciousness, in the same low, even voice she used for everything else. She had been given a small sitting room adjacent to the estate office, a practical arrangement since she often worked late, and on cold evenings she kept a fire going in it and read after supper. I was aware of this. I was aware that the light showed under the door of that room until quite late some evenings, and that this was a detail I had acquired not through any deliberate act of attention, but simply through inhabiting the same house and being, by that point, someone who noticed where she was. I did not say anything about this either, but I had begun, somewhere in those December weeks, to understand that the silence in the house had changed not because of any alteration in the house itself, but because it was now inhabited by 2 people rather than 1, and that I had learned to tell the difference. Christmas came and went. Philippa arrived the week before with her husband, Colonel Ashton, and their 2 sons, and the house expanded briefly into something that resembled its former self, and then they left again and it contracted. Philippa pulled me aside before she departed and said, with her characteristic directness, "The Marsh girl is very good. I knew she would be. You look better." I made a sound that was not quite agreement. Philippa studied me for a moment with the expression she had developed over 37 years of being my sister, and then she said, "Do not do anything foolish," and got into the carriage. I did not ask her what she meant. I was fairly confident I already knew. January arrived, and with it the particular bleakness of the estate in deep winter, the fields bare, the trees stripped, the sky a permanent pale gray. In any previous January I had spent here, this bleakness had seemed apt. This January it merely seemed like winter. The difference was small and everything. It was in the 2nd week of January that Miss Marsh found the anomaly. She came to find me in the library, not at the 10 o'clock hour, but in the late afternoon, when I was attempting to read and not entirely succeeding. And she had the September quarter accounts in one hand, and what appeared to be a supplementary ledger I had not previously seen in the other. "Your Grace," she said, "I believe there may be a more significant problem than the doubled payments I found in November. May I show you?" I put down the book. She spread the accounts on the library table and walked me through it with the same measured precision she brought to everything. A pattern in the estate management fees paid to the London solicitors over a period of 4 years. Fees that had been increasing in a manner that bore no correspondence to the services actually rendered. Fees that had, in some quarters, been charged twice under different descriptive labels. The total, across 4 years, represented a sum that made me still. "You are telling me," I said, "that my London solicitors have been systematically overcharging this estate for 4 years." "I am telling you that the accounts appear to show that," she said carefully. "I would want to compare these against the original engagement letters and the correspondence before making that conclusion formally. But the pattern is," she paused, "the pattern is consistent enough that I thought you should know immediately." I looked at the figures. I looked at the neat annotations she had made in the margins. I thought of the gray months and the ledgers I had barely been able to focus on, and the space that had existed in that inattention for this kind of careful, patient theft. "When did you notice this?" I said. "I began to suspect it approximately 10 days ago," she said. "I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you." 10 days she had been sitting with this, checking and rechecking, building the case with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything. 10 days she had carried this without troubling me with uncertain half-conclusions. "Thank you," I said, and then, because it was not enough, "Miss Marsh, this is exceptional work." She looked at me for a moment, the composed gray eyes level, measuring. "It is my work, Your Grace," she said. "You needed to know." She left the ledgers with me and went to prepare the comparative summary I would need to write to London. That evening I sat alone in the library for a long time, and I did not stare at the wall. I thought instead about the fact that this woman, this debtor's daughter who had come to me on a mail coach with a leather case of accounting instruments, who had never once asked for acknowledgement or positioned herself for advantage or performed any kind of visible effort, had in 2 months repaid her first year's salary several times over in money recovered and money saved, and was in the process of potentially recovering 4 years of theft, and seemed to regard all of this as simply what one did when one was given a job. I also thought about other things. I put those other things away. The London matter was resolved by the end of February, with the result I had expected. The solicitors concerned had no satisfying explanation for the discrepancies, declined to provide one when formally challenged, and were replaced. The sum in question was not recovered. In the short term, this was not worth the cost of the litigation. But the pattern was closed, and the new solicitors, who came recommended and who were, I noted, more carefully supervised from the first, were engaged at a fraction of the previous fee. In the weeks between the initial discovery and the final resolution, I found myself relying on Miss Marsh in ways that went well beyond what the terms of her engagement had specified. She attended every meeting with my London solicitor in the capacity of a witness whose command of the figures was, as that gentleman later admitted, more thorough than his own. She prepared the correspondence with the precision of someone who understands that the language of a formal challenge is itself an argument, and she caught, on 2 separate occasions, errors in the draft letters that would have significantly weakened the position I was trying to establish. She did all of this without once exceeding the boundaries of what she was asked to do, without once inviting herself into a conversation or inserting an opinion that had not been solicited. And yet somehow she was always exactly where the situation needed her to be, with exactly the information the situation needed her to have. I was aware during this period of a shift in the way I worked. I had, before her arrival, managed the estate in the manner of a man trying to hold a number of heavy objects aloft simultaneously, aware that he cannot do it indefinitely, losing his grip on one in the act of securing another, and exhausted by the whole endeavor. Working alongside Miss Marsh was different. She was not performing assistance. She was not managing me. She was simply thinking alongside me, with the same thoroughness and the same objective, and the result was that things that had seemed impossibly tangled began to resolve into their component parts and address themselves in order. The morning the last letter went to London, the formal termination of the previous solicitors and the engagement of the new ones, the matter closed and properly documented. She came in to tell me the post had gone, and I looked up from the desk where I had been working, and the thing that I saw in her face was not triumph. It was not the expression of someone who wanted recognition for what they had done. It was the expression of a person for whom the work itself is the point, who finds in a thing well done a satisfaction that requires no external acknowledgement, because the thing itself is enough. I had known people who claimed this quality and did not have it. She had it in the most complete way I had ever encountered. Miss Marsh wrote up the summary of the matter with the same precise hand as always, and left it on my desk with a small note that said only, "New solicitors engaged as of the 24th. All transfer documentation complete." I stood in the estate office holding that note for a longer time than was entirely explicable. March came with the first thaw, and something thawed in me alongside it, though I was only dimly aware of it at the time. I began to spend more time in the estate office. I told myself this was because the spring work required close coordination, the tenants' planting agreements to be reviewed, the seed purchases to approve, the agreements with the neighboring estates regarding the shared drainage channel that had been under dispute for 18 months, and that Miss Marsh had, with characteristic efficiency, reduced to 2 clear points of difference that could be resolved with 1 letter to each party. She was writing that letter one morning in late March when I arrived at the estate office to find that someone had delivered a quantity of cut spring flowers, the first of the season, primrose and early white blossoms from the gardens, and left them on the corner of her table. She was working around them with an air of mild puzzlement. "Who sent those?" I said. She looked up. "I am not certain. Mrs. Bellamy said they came from the kitchen garden." She paused. "Perhaps for the office," she said, in the tone of someone extending maximum charity to a situation. It was not the kitchen garden. It was Thomas, my underfootman, who was 19 and had decided, in the way of 19-year-old underfootmen, that Miss Marsh was the most remarkable creature he had ever encountered, and that flowers were the appropriate response to this conclusion. I became aware of this through Mrs. Bellamy. I became aware of it, I will be honest, with a feeling that I identified only some time later as displeasure. I said nothing about the flowers. I said nothing about Thomas. I reviewed the letter to the neighboring estates regarding the drainage channel, which was excellent, and approved it and left. That afternoon I walked further than I had walked in months, out past the home farm and along the river path to the old mill and back through the eastern fields. It was the first time since my return that I had walked without a particular destination or a particular mood of grimness propelling me. I simply walked. The fields were turning green at the edges. The river was running high and fast with the snowmelt. It was a fine afternoon, and I found, to my own slight surprise, that I was able to register that it was fine without the registering feeling like an accusation. I had, it seemed, begun to come back. Slowly, without fanfare, without a decisive moment I could point to, I had begun to come back. There was an afternoon in early April, the sort of mild, uncertain afternoon that the season produces when it cannot decide between winter and spring, when I came to the estate office at the usual hour and found that Miss Marsh was not there. The door was open and the room was empty, the papers stacked with their customary precision, but she was not in her chair. I was, and I note this without pride, notably at a loss as to what to do with myself. I looked at the stacked papers. I looked at the door. After a moment I went in search of Mrs. Bellamy, who told me that Miss Marsh had taken a brief walk through the kitchen garden, as she sometimes did in the early afternoon when the weather allowed. I went to the kitchen garden. She was standing at the far end, near the old stone wall that bordered the kitchen garden from the formal beds, examining a section of the wall where the mortar had begun to fail. She had her dark blue coat on, and her hands were in her pockets, and she was looking at the wall with the same careful attention she brought to ledger columns. "The pointing here needs to be redone this summer," she said when she heard me approach. She did not appear surprised to see me. "The section above the lavender bed is already beginning to shift. If it is left until autumn, it will likely come down in the first hard frost and take 2 of the lavender plants with it." "I will tell the head gardener," I said. She nodded. She looked at the wall for a moment more, and then she looked out beyond it, to where the parkland fell away toward the river and the old mill stood on the far bank, its wheel just visible above the tree line, still and dark in the pale afternoon light. Her expression was the one she had at the library window, not quite wistful, not quite content, but something between the two that belonged to a woman who had learned, over several years and several households, to be very careful with what she allowed herself to hope for. "You like it here?" I said. She considered the question with the same thoroughness she gave to everything. "Yes," she said at last. "More than I had expected to, more than—" She stopped and began again. "I have moved a great deal, from one household to the next. One always hopes a place will feel like staying, and some of them have not. And this one, I said. She looked at me and then away carefully. This one, she said, feels like staying. I said nothing to that. I should have. I know now precisely what I should have said, that I wanted it to stay too, that the thing she described as feeling like staying was the same thing I had been circling since December without knowing what to call it. I did not say it, and she did not press me because she never pressed, and we walked back to the house talking about the kitchen garden wall and which section of the mortar was in the worst state, which was so thoroughly not what either of us was talking about that I am still, years later, mildly in awe of how much information two people can exchange while nominally discussing masonry. In the evenings I sometimes sat in the library long after the rest of the household had retired, and I thought about that. I thought about the quality of the days now, how they had changed from the hollow kind of days I had been inhabiting before she came, to days that had texture and direction and movement, days where I woke in the morning with the particular sense of a man who has somewhere to be. Not because there was crisis or urgency, but because there was work to do with someone who took it seriously, and conversation that went somewhere, and the occasional moment in a kitchen garden or at a library window when the world outside the narrow work corridor became visible again, and was, against all expectation, worth looking at. I thought about the difference between useful and wanted, between adequate and chosen, between the person one requires for the running of things and the person whose presence reorders the quality of the air. I thought about this at some length and then put the thoughts away and went to bed, because I was still, at that point, a man who believed that the right moment would eventually present itself, and that there was no hurry, and that the thing he was waiting to say could wait a little longer without consequence. I was wrong about that, but I would not know it for another several weeks. April deepened. There were mornings when the light came in off the parkland and through the east windows of the estate office and lay across the desk where she worked in long, pale bars, and she sat in that light with her papers and her annotations, and I found reasons to be in the estate office longer than I needed to be. One morning I brought 2 cups of coffee from the breakfast room, something I had never done, something that was plainly not within the usual arrangement of the household, and set one beside her papers without comment. She looked at it. She looked at me. She said, "Thank you, Your Grace," and drank it and said nothing else. But she did not look surprised, which told me something. Another morning I came in to find her reading, not accounts, but a volume she had brought from somewhere, a book of natural history with detailed plates of English birds. She put it away quickly when I appeared, with the manner of someone who has been caught doing something pleasant that they were not sure was permitted. "You may read here," I said. "That is not in conflict with anything." She looked at me for a moment. I did not know if it would be considered. "Miss Marsh, you are paid to manage my accounts. You are not required to give me every hour of the day." I paused. "What is the book?" She showed me. We talked about English birds for 20 minutes, which is a more interesting conversation than it sounds when the other person has the kind of mind she had, precise and observant and full of details she had collected quietly over years and never been invited to produce. She had seen a kingfisher on the river below the old mill, she told me. She had not expected it. She had stood on the bank and watched it for nearly 5 minutes before it flew. I had not been to the river path in months. I told myself as I left the estate office that I would go the following morning. I went that afternoon to the place she had described, and I stood on the bank for the better part of an hour. I did not see the kingfisher. I went back the following morning. I saw it. I found her in the estate office and said, "The kingfisher, at the bend in the river path below the old elm." She looked up and her whole face changed, opened briefly like a window. "You saw it." "For approximately 3 minutes," I said, "before it flew upstream." She smiled. She had a small smile, contained and somewhat rare, and it produced in me a sensation that I declined to analyze. "They return to the same section of river," she said. "Year after year I have read. They are faithful creatures." "So I understand," I said, and the sentence, as it left my mouth, carried more weight than I had given it when I began it. And we both noticed this, and neither of us said so, and I went back to the library and sat with a book I could not read for the better part of an hour. Philippa arrived in April for a visit she had not announced, which with Philippa means she has something to say, and has decided to say it in person. She said it at dinner, which she had arranged to be just the 2 of us, which was unusual and which I noted. She waited until the second course was served, and then she said, with the manner of someone deploying a prepared position, "I have been speaking with Lady Carfield about her niece." I set down my fork. "Have you?" "She is a very accomplished girl. 22, excellent family, considerable fortune. She is interested in the country life and would, I believe, take on the management of a large estate with great enthusiasm." She paused. "I have told Lady Carfield that I would speak to you." "You told Lady Carfield?" I stopped. I looked at my sister. "Philippa, what exactly have you told Lady Carfield?" She met my eyes without flinching, because Philippa has never flinched in her life. "I told her that you are at a stage where the question of the succession needs to be taken seriously, which it does. I told her that you are considering the matter, which you should be. I told her that a visit informally in the spring might be appropriate." A pause. "And I said that it might be sensible when such a visit occurred for the household to be arranged accordingly. For it to be clear what and who is a permanent fixture of the household and what is a—" She stopped. "Say what you mean," I said. She looked down at her plate and then back up, and there was something in her expression that was not her usual efficiency, something quieter and more careful. "She is very good," she said. "Miss Marsh, I do not say otherwise, but you know as well as I do that a bookkeeper, however excellent, cannot be a permanent feature of the family at Drentham. People will begin to talk. People may already be talking. And if you bring a young woman of Lady Carfield's nieces standing here while the situation is ambiguous—" "The situation," I said, "is not ambiguous." "Marcus," she said, using my given name, which she reserves for moments when she wants me to understand that she is speaking to me as a sister rather than as a social strategist. "I am not saying this to distress you. I am saying it because I love you and because I want the right thing for you. Whatever you may feel, and I am not asking you to tell me, the practical reality is that Miss Marsh's position here needs to be resolved. Clearly, before Lady Carfield's niece arrives." I said nothing for a long time. Outside the dining room windows, the April evening was turning from gray to dark blue. "When," I said at last, "were you proposing this visit to occur?" "The 3rd week of May," Philippa said. "Lady Carfield's niece has a prior engagement in London until then." I said nothing more about it that evening. Philippa, who knows when she has pushed as far as she should, did not press me. We finished dinner and spoke of other things, and she departed the following morning with a kiss on my cheek and a look that said she trusted I would be sensible. I was, as it turned out, not sensible. I did not speak to Miss Marsh about the visit. I did not speak to her about any of it. I told myself I was thinking through the practical arrangements and would address the matter at the appropriate time. This was another of the fictions I had become skilled at maintaining. What I did instead was, I went to my solicitors, the new ones who were more trustworthy and a great deal more straightforward, and I told them I wished to draw up a settlement document. They listened. They asked several careful questions. They went away to draft the papers. That took 9 days. During those 9 days, I continued to appear in the estate office at 10 o'clock each morning. I continued to review the accounts with Miss Marsh. We walked on 2 occasions through the formal gardens. She stopped at the rose beds, which were just beginning to show their first leaf, and said, "These have been badly pruned. The new growth at the crown has been cut back rather than the old wood at the base. If it is not corrected this year, the bushes will exhaust themselves within 2 seasons." "How do you know that?" I said. "My mother kept roses," she said, simply, without elaboration, the way she said most things. I looked at her standing there in the morning light in her dark blue dress that was not new, looking at the rose beds with that steady practical attention she gave to everything, timber projections, fraudulent solicitors' fees, pruned badly rose bushes, and I thought, I should tell you now. What I have arranged with the solicitors, what I intend, what I want. I should tell you. I did not tell her. One morning she came to find me in the breakfast room with a question about the tenant rent schedule, whether a particular modification she had identified would be better implemented before or after the summer quarter. And while we were talking, a letter arrived in the morning post from London, and the sight of it made her pause. She did not ask about it. But her eyes went to it and then away, and I understood in the small flinch that was not quite a flinch, that she had at some point in the past months begun to wonder whether the arrangements here might change, and that she was carrying this quietly, the way she carried everything. I should have spoken then. I know it. I knew it at the time, in the particular way one knows something and then proceeds to act as though one does not. "After the summer quarter," I said, Let us wait until the position is clearer." She said, "Yes, Your Grace," and wrote it in her notes, and we talked about something else. But the conversation was slightly different afterward, not worse, not strained, but with a new quality of carefulness in it, as though she had begun, without making a decision to do so, to hold certain things at a slightly greater distance. I noticed it and understood its cause and said nothing, which was, I recognize, a pattern I had been repeating for 9 days with increasing consequence. On the 5th day, I came down early and found her in the estate office at 7 in the morning, which was unusual. She had a letter in front of her and was writing a reply in the small, precise hand that I would by then have recognized anywhere. When she heard me, she put the letter away. I saw before she did so that it was addressed to her uncle in Alderton. I saw, in the 2 lines visible before it was folded, the words, "I am uncertain how long," and nothing more. I stood in the doorway. The morning was cool and she had not yet lit the fire, and the gray light came through the east window and lay across the desk and across her hands, which were very still now on the closed letter. "I am sorry to interrupt," I said. "You have not interrupted," she said. "I was finishing. Is there something you needed, Your Grace?" There was a great deal I needed, every word of which was available to me and none of which I said. "The Hadley account," I said instead. "I wanted to confirm the extended period was recorded." "It is recorded," she said and showed me. I looked at it, I thanked her, I left. On the 8th day I passed the estate office in the late afternoon, and the door was slightly ajar and she was not working. She was standing at the window, looking out at the formal gardens, at the rose beds that were coming on well now, and her arms were crossed lightly over herself in the way of someone who is thinking hard about something they cannot resolve by thinking. She did not see me. I did not announce myself. I walked past and went upstairs and stood at my own window for some time. I had, I think, some idea that there was a correct moment for it, a proper arrangement, a prepared speech, a setting that was adequate to what I meant. I was, after all, a man who had spent 38 years living in the world of formal arrangement and proper order. I knew how these things were done. I was waiting for the right moment to declare itself. The right moment did not declare itself. Or rather, and this is the truth that I could not avoid once I had enough distance to see it, the right moment was there every morning for 9 days, ordinary and available and patient, and I let it pass each time. In its place, I developed an increasing and precise awareness of everything I would lose if I waited too long, which I carried through those 9 days with the particular stupidity of a man who knows exactly what he is risking and cannot stop risking it. On the 9th day, I went to collect the papers from my solicitors. On the 10th day, Philippa returned. She returned with the efficiency of a general taking a position, and she had, in the interval since her last visit, apparently done a great deal more than speak to Lady Carfield. She arrived with her maid and her personal secretary, and with a particular manner I recognized from childhood, the manner of someone who has decided that a thing is going to happen and is proceeding accordingly. At dinner that evening she told me that Lady Carfield's niece, Miss Henley, would arrive on Thursday. This was Monday. She had arranged suitable accommodations and planned several social occasions that would allow me to become acquainted with Miss Henley in a suitably informal atmosphere. I said, "I see." Philippa said, "And it would be appropriate. I have already spoken to Mrs. Bellamy for Miss Marsh to take her leave by Wednesday." The silence that fell after this was the most significant silence I had produced since the ones I had been producing for the better part of 14 months. But it was a different variety. It was not the hollow kind. "You have spoken to Mrs. Bellamy," I said. "Yes. The estate accounts are in order. She has done excellent work. It is not a question of her performance." "Philippa," my voice was very level, "you spoke to my housekeeper about dismissing a member of my staff without speaking to me first." Philippa's color rose slightly. "I spoke to Mrs. Bellamy about the domestic arrangements, which is within the purview of—" "Go to bed," I said. "We will speak in the morning." She went. I sat at the dining table for a long time. I sat there until the candles had burned down to their holders and the fire had gone to embers, and what I was doing, though I did not frame it to myself in these terms, was conducting a thorough accounting of my own conduct over the preceding 9 days, which did not return a flattering result. I had the papers. They were in my study. The solicitors had drafted them, a settlement, a formal proposition, the papers that said what I intended and what I was prepared to offer and what I hoped, with a degree of hope I had not known I possessed until it was now in this quiet room about to be taken from me. I should go to her. I thought it clearly. Go to her tonight, tell her what I should have told her 9 days ago, give her the facts before Mrs. Bellamy's confirmation of them arrives in the morning. I knew where she would be, the small sitting room adjacent to the estate office where she took her evenings, always with a book or with letters to her uncle in Alderton. I knew the route. I knew the words, or most of them. I did not go. I told myself it was too late in the evening. I told myself there was a proper way to do these things, and that appearing at her sitting room door after midnight was not it. I told myself I would rise early and speak to her before the morning post arrived, before Mrs. Bellamy had occasion to say anything. I did not rise early enough. In the morning, Mrs. Bellamy came to find me before I had finished dressing and said, with the expression of someone delivering news they would rather not deliver, "Miss Marsh asked to speak with me last evening, Your Grace." She had heard the walls are thin in the east corridor when voices are raised. She had heard enough to understand that her position was to be. She asked only that I confirm whether the situation was as she understood it. And Mrs. Bellamy stopped. I confirmed it, Your Grace. I did not think it was my place to say otherwise, and she asked me directly. I was very still, and then she thanked me and said she would be ready to leave this morning. A pause. She is ready now, Your Grace. She has her trunk packed and has arranged for the mail coach at 10. I looked at the clock. It was 8:30. She did not wish to, I stopped. She said nothing else. She left a note on the estate office desk for whoever takes over the accounts, Mrs. Bellamy said. A summary of the current position, where everything is, what is outstanding. A pause, very small. She is very thorough, Your Grace. I went to the window. The morning was gray and very still. What I am about to tell you is not, to my own mind, a glorious admission. I stood at that window for approximately 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes I experienced the full and vivid consequence of every moment in the past 9 days when the correct words had been present and available, and I had elected not to say them. She was leaving. She had packed her trunk with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. She had left a note for her successor. She was leaving with her back straight and her dignity intact, and without any knowledge of the fact that I had already decided 9 days ago, in a solicitor's office in town, what I wanted, who I wanted, and had simply failed to say so. I left the window, I went to the desk, I opened the drawer. I was too late for that morning. Let me be clear about this. I was too late for the graceful moment. The prepared speech, the correct setting, the formal arrangement, those were gone. What was left was me, in my shirt sleeves, with papers I had not yet signed and a half-dressed urgency that was, I think, the most honest I had been with myself in 18 months. I went to find Philippa. She was at breakfast, and when she saw my face, she put down her cup. "Where is she going?" I said. "Marcus." "Where is Miss Marsh going? Does she have family? A situation to go to? Where is she going?" Philippa looked at me for a moment, and then something shifted in her expression. The strategic intelligence fell away, and what was underneath it was simply my sister, who had known me my whole life and who, whatever else she had managed badly, loved me. "She has an uncle," she said quietly. "He has a small farm holding. Alderton. It is 12 miles from here on the old road." I left the room. I did not finish dressing. I found the gray horse already saddled because, as I have mentioned, my valet is extraordinary, and I rode. Let me tell you what 12 miles on a gray morning looks like when you are riding, because you have finally understood what you are about to lose. The old road to Alderton runs along the river for the first 4 miles and then climbs through the beech woods and comes down into the valley where the village sits. The mail coach takes this road, and it is not fast. The road is uneven, and there are 2 gates to open. I had the gray horse, and I had the urgency of a man who has very recently understood the precise cost of choosing the wrong moment to be cautious, and I made good time. I passed the mail coach on the hill above the village. The coachman raised an eyebrow at me but did not stop. I was not trying to stop it. I knew, from the detail of the schedule that was so clear in my mind, I might as well have had it written on paper, that the mail coach had not yet reached Alderton. The stop was the inn at the crossroads. She would be there for perhaps 10 minutes while the horses were changed. I reached the crossroads before the coach. I stood in the inn yard with my horse and the morning light and the sound of the river somewhere below, and I waited. The coach arrived at the Crossroads Inn with the reliable unpunctuality of the county mail service, 4 minutes late, which in this instance was enough to matter. I heard it before I saw it, the creak and clatter of the wheels on the stone-surfaced road, the coachman calling ahead to the ostlers in the yard, the sound of it slowing. And then there it was, coming under the arch into the inn yard, dark green and muddy from the road, and the ostlers moving to the horses and the door swinging open. She stepped down from it with her leather case in her hand and her trunk being handed down behind her, and she turned toward the inn door, and then she saw me. I had not, in the course of these 12 miles, organized a speech. This was, in retrospect, consistent with my general performance over the preceding 9 days. What I had was the papers which I had taken from the desk before I left the house and which were now somewhat crumpled in my coat pocket. What I had was the plain and unadorned truth of the situation. What I had was her, standing in an inn yard in Alderton on a gray morning, looking at me with those steady gray eyes, her trunk on the ground beside her and her leather case in her hand. She was entirely composed. Of course she was. She had been composing herself since before I was out of bed, I imagined, had made her decision, packed her things, left her note, and committed herself to the orderly exit that was the only kind she was capable of. She had, I understood then with a clarity that felt very much like being struck, decided that this was simply what happened. That she had been sufficient and then had been superseded, and that this was the shape of things, and she was carrying it the way she carried everything, quietly, without complaint, with all her dignity perfectly intact. That she could do this, that she was capable of walking away from Drentham Hall with her back straight and her leather case in her hand, and her thorough note left on the desk for whoever came next, was the most heartbreaking thing I had ever witnessed, and it was heartbreaking precisely because it was so characteristic of her. "Miss Marsh," I said. "Your Grace," a curtsy composed. "I was not aware you would be." "I know," I said. "I should have been a great many things before this morning that I was not. May I speak with you? Properly. Not," I looked at the coachman, who was making a credible effort to appear uninterested. "Not here in the yard, is there?" I looked at the inn. "May we sit?" She looked at me for a long moment. In that moment, whatever had kept her moving all morning, the quiet efficiency of a woman who will not let herself feel things before she has dealt with the practical necessities, wavered very slightly. Something moved in her eyes that was not composure. "Yes," she said. "We may sit." We sat on the bench outside the inn, and the coachman leaned on the coach with the air of a man who has decided this is worth a delayed departure, and the morning was gray and still, and the inn yard smelled of horses and bread, and I produced the crumpled papers from my coat pocket. 9 days ago," I said, "I went to my solicitors and asked them to draw up a settlement document, a formal proposition." I set the papers on the bench between us. "I have not yet signed them, which is not a reflection of uncertainty about what they contain, but of a failing that is entirely mine, which is the failing of a man who knew what he wished to say and could not find the moment to say it, and kept waiting for a better one and waited too long." She looked at the papers. She did not touch them. "I wanted to speak to you before my sister's visit," I said. "Before any arrangement was made, any conversation had with anyone, I wanted to speak to you first. I intended to. I had the papers in my desk for 9 days, and I stopped. I looked at my hands. I have not always been able to say the things I mean to say. The war, something changed in the way it has been a great deal easier in these past months to inhabit the world than it has been in a long time, and I have been, I think, slow to trust that it will remain so. Slow to act on what I know because knowledge and action require a confidence that I have had to rebuild very carefully." I paused. "That is not an excuse. It is only an explanation. What I should have done, and did not, was tell you what I had decided before you heard something quite different through a wall in the east corridor." She was very still. Her hands were in her lap, close around the handle of her leather case. "What," she said very quietly, "had you decided?" I looked at the papers on the bench between us. "That I intended to ask for your hand," I said. "That I had arranged the practical framework for a proposal and had then failed to produce the proposal, which is, I am aware of how this reflects on me. I am aware it is not a distinguished account." A pause. "But I also want to say plainly, I know what the position looks like. I know what the argument is for why this is not what one does. I know that you have come here in a professional capacity, and that I am a duke, and that the distance between those positions is, I know all of it. I am not asking you to ignore it. I am asking you to hear what I want to say despite it." She looked at me. Her gray eyes were very steady, and there was something in them I could not entirely read, something that was not composure exactly, but was very careful. "Then say it," she said. "I do not want you to leave," I said. "I have not wanted you to leave since approximately the middle of December. I have been, as I say, slow to act on this. But the reason I have not wanted you to leave is not because the estate runs better when you are in it, though it does. It is not because I have grown accustomed to 10 o'clock and the daily summary, though I have. It is because—" I stopped. Because the words for this were the ones I had been working up to for months, and they were simple and somewhat bare, and I had learned in the past 9 days that the only way to say such things is to simply say them. "It is because you made the house inhabitable again. You, specifically. And because I am a very different man now than I was in November, and the difference runs in the direction of you." The inn yard was quiet. Somewhere a door opened and the smell of bread from the kitchen came out on the morning air, and she sat very still with her leather case in her hands, and she looked at the papers on the bench, and then she looked at me. "You truly went to the solicitors," she said. "9 days ago. Before your sister came." "Yes." A long silence. "I thought," she said, and her voice was different now, still quiet, but with something in it that was not careful, that was something else entirely. "I thought this morning that it was simply what I had learned to expect. That position's end. That I am always sufficient, always adequate, never—" She stopped. "You are not adequate," I said, which came out rather bluntly. "You are—" I looked for the right word and found that the usual language was not up to the task. "You made the house inhabitable again," I said. "You and your ledgers and your timber projections and your directness and you specifically, and I would very much like you to stay." "Not as my bookkeeper." She looked at me for a long moment. The inn yard was quiet except for the sound of the horses. "You are quite certain," she said, "that this is what you want?" "I was quite certain 9 days ago," I said. "I am considerably more certain now, having ridden 12 miles in my shirt sleeves." Something happened in her face then. Something broke open, very quietly, the way ice breaks on a river when the thaw comes, from the inside rather than the outside, without noise and all at once. It was not quite a smile. It was something more private than a smile. It was the expression of a woman who has been holding herself very tightly for a very long time and has just been given permission to set something down. "Your Grace," she said. "Marcus," I said. "I think, given the circumstances." "Marcus," she said, and she looked down at the crumpled papers on the bench between us, and then she looked back up at me. "I will not pretend I understood everything about you these past months. You are still somewhat in pieces, I think, in ways that have nothing to do with accounts or timber, and I will not pretend that does not concern me because I am not in the habit of pretending things." She paused. "But I am very good at accounts." "And I have been—" She stopped again, and then, with the decisiveness of someone who has spent enough time being careful, "I did not want to leave." "Then do not," I said. She looked at the papers. "May I read them?" "Yes." She read them. She read them with the same thorough attention she had given the timber projections and the solicitor's fraudulent fees, and she asked 2 questions of clarification, and she pointed out one clause that she thought was less clear than it should be. I said that we could address that with the solicitors. She said she supposed we could. Then she folded them carefully and held them in her hands and looked at the gray morning above the inn yard, and she said, "Yes." Just that, yes, plainly the way she said everything. I had to sit with that for a moment before I was sure I had heard it correctly. When I was sure, I said, "Thank you." She turned to look at me, and the thing in her face that had broken open was still there, the private, quiet thing, not yet fully at the surface, but present, definitely present. "You should not thank me," she said. "It is not a favor." "No," I said, "it is not." We sat in the inn yard for a moment longer, in the gray morning, with the horses and the coachman and the smell of bread. And then I stood up and offered her my hand, and she took it, and we walked back to the gray horse together. The coachman called out, "Will the lady be needing the coach, sir?" "No," I said, "she will not." She rode behind me on the gray horse on the way back to Drentham Hall. She sat very straight, and the morning was brightening now, the gray coming off the sky and something warmer showing behind it, and we did not speak for the first mile. We did not need to. There is a kind of silence between 2 people that is the opposite of the hollow kind. That is full of what has just been said, and what does not yet need to be said, and is restful in the way that only silences between people who have decided something can be. Somewhere in the beech woods, she said, against the sound of the wind and the hooves and the birds in the canopy above. You should have told me 9 days ago. Yes, I said, I should have. You are going to have to learn to say things when you mean to say them, she said. I am aware, I said. I can help with that, she said. It is, in essence, an organizational problem. I laughed. I had not expected to laugh, and the sound of it in the beech woods was strange and clean and very much mine. Mine in a way I had not felt in a long time, as though it had come from somewhere that had been quiet for too many months, and had now, in a gray April morning on an old road between beech trees, remembered how to make a sound. She was quiet for a moment after, and then she laughed too, and that sound was better still. It was warmer and more surprised, and it joined with the sound of the wind in the canopy and rose up into the gray and gold morning air, and I thought, there it is. There is what I had not been able to say. We arrived back at Drentham Hall in time for lunch. Philippa was in the entrance hall, and when she saw us, me in my shirt sleeves with 12 miles of road dust on my coat, and Miss Marsh behind me with her leather case, her trunk to follow on the next post, something happened in Philippa's face that was almost, not quite, but very nearly sheepishness. Marcus, she said. Philippa, I said, Miss Marsh will be staying, permanently, under somewhat different arrangements than the previous ones, which I will explain to you in due course. I would ask you to write to Lady Carfield and express my regrets. Philippa looked at Miss Marsh. Miss Marsh looked at Philippa with an expression that was polite and steady, and contained something underneath it that I recognized as the same quality she brought to everything. The quiet refusal to be rattled, the perfect composure of a woman who knows exactly who she is, who has walked through several long years of being thought of as sufficient and adequate and not quite enough, and has kept her own estimation intact through all of it. You are certain, Philippa said to me. I was certain 9 days ago, I said. I have simply had a rather vigorous morning confirming it. Philippa looked between us for a long moment. And then, because she is my sister and she does love me, and because she had eyes in her head and had had them for several months, she did what she always does when she has reached the limit of her capacity to manage a situation. She submitted to it with grace. She said, I will write to Lady Carfield this afternoon. And she turned to Miss Marsh and said, with the decisive warmth of a woman who commits thoroughly to whatever position she has taken, welcome then, properly. Miss Marsh said, thank you, Lady Ashton, polite, composed, with that small, private thing still alive in her face that I was going to spend a very long time learning to read properly. We were married in June. The rose beds had been properly pruned by then, on Miss Marsh's instruction, relayed through the head gardener with the same precise specificity she brought to everything, and they were beginning to come back, the new growth running green and vigorous at the base now, the old wood properly cleared, the shape of the bushes opening up into what they were supposed to be. The way things do when they are given the correct attention and a little time. The ceremony was small. A few neighbors, Philippa and Colonel Ashton, Mrs. Bellamy, and the senior staff. She wore pale cream silk, which was not the first thing I noticed when she came into the chapel, because the first thing I noticed was her face, the way it was composed and open at the same time, the small private thing that had been living in it since the inn yard at Alderton, now closer to the surface, more visible, as though she had decided that it could come out into the light now, as though she had put down the last of what she had been carrying and found herself lighter than she had expected. The solicitors attended, and the new papers, properly signed this time, were in perfect order. My valet presented them to me the morning of the wedding with the expression of a man who has never once doubted how the situation would resolve. I thanked him. He said, the gray horse is at the door, your grace, should you require her. And then, because he is perfect, he did not explain what he meant by that and did not need to. I did not require the gray horse. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, for the first time in longer than I could easily measure, and everything else followed from there. Thomas, the under-footman who had sent the primroses, was reassigned to the north wing that autumn and has since, by all accounts, found a more suitable object for his admiration in a baker's daughter in the village. I wish him well. There is a particular thing she does, my wife. She is my wife. And I find that I am still, months later, apt to sit with that phrase for a moment when I produce it, the way one sits with a good thing to make sure it is real, when she is working at the estate office desk and something in the accounts pleases her. It is not a smile, quite. It is a small settling, a very slight relaxation in the line of her shoulders, a quality of stillness that is different from her ordinary stillness. The first time I noticed it, I was standing in the doorway, and she did not know I was there. And I stood there for rather longer than I should have, and watched it with a feeling I could not have named at the time, and now know is simply happiness. She looked up eventually. She said, "You are loitering, Marcus." I said, "I am." She said, "Is there something you wanted to say?" I said, "Yes," and I came in and I said it. That is the difference now. I say things when I mean to say them. I am not always graceful about it. I am sometimes blunt and occasionally badly timed, and once memorably I said something in the wrong order and had to go back to the beginning. But I say them. She has been, as promised, helpful in this regard. She has a gift for seeing the thing one is approaching from the side and meeting it directly, which has saved us both considerable time. She has also been, as I always knew she would be, correct about the rose beds, which are, this summer, magnificent. And the timber in the northern parcel is regenerating at exactly the rate she predicted, and the tenant accounts are the most orderly they have been in 20 years, and the wall at the edge of the kitchen garden has been repointed, and the drainage dispute with the neighboring estates was settled in March, quietly by letter, exactly as she said it could be. I think of that gray morning in the inn yard sometimes, the crumpled papers on the bench, the sound of the horses, the smell of bread from the inn kitchen, her face when she read them. I think of the 12 miles and the gray horse and the coat I was still wearing at dinner because I never went back upstairs to change it. I think of the moment in the beech woods when she laughed, and the sound of it, and how it felt like proof of something I had not yet put into words. I think also of the 9 days I spent with the papers in my desk and the correct moment always somewhere just ahead of me, and the lesson in those 9 days which I have not required to learn twice. The correct moment is the one where you are standing in front of her. That is all it is. That is all it ever was. There is no better setting than the present one, no speech more prepared than the honest truth, no arrangement more correct than simply saying the thing. I learned this at 38 years old in an inn yard in Alderton, in my shirt sleeves, with a crumpled piece of paper in my coat pocket. I count it among the more useful pieces of education I have received, and it cost me considerably less than the other kinds. She is downstairs now in the estate office. I can hear the faint scratch of her pen, and below it, fainter still, the sound of the river from the upper corridor because the morning is still and the windows are open, and the river is in flood just now with the late spring rains and running fast and bright over its stones. She will have noticed this. She notices everything. She will have already made a note about the low bridge at the south pasture and whether the crossing needs to be watched. She will have, without being asked, taken care of the thing that needs taking care of. I am going to go downstairs. I'm going to tell her that the timber report from the northern parcel has come in, and the numbers are exactly as she predicted 3 years ago, which is a thing she will receive with the small settling of shoulders that is her version of satisfaction. And then I'm going to tell her something else that has nothing to do with timber, which is that this morning, standing at the upper corridor window listening to the river and the pen below, I thought, I am the most fortunate man in 3 counties. And I thought it with the easy certainty of something that has simply become true, the way the house became inhabitable again, gradually, and then entirely. She walked away with nothing on an April morning, in her dark blue coat that was not new, with her leather case and her dignity and her quiet, determined refusal to be anything less than herself. She had no idea, when she stepped down from that mail coach, that the papers were already in my pocket. She had no idea I had already decided. I am very glad I caught up with her. I intend, for the rest of my life, not to require the gray horse a second time. The house is inhabited. I am once more myself. And she is downstairs.